A millionaire ignored a little beggar girl who was asking for alms on Christmas Eve. Regretful, he decided to follow the girl and was shocked by what he saw. The steady beep of heart monitors echoed through the sterile operating room as Thomas Mitchell lay unconscious, his life hanging by a thread. The surgical team worked with precision, their movements careful and deliberate as they attempted to repair his failing heart. Sweat beaded on the chief surgeon's forehead as he navigated the delicate procedure. Blood pressure dropping, a nurse announced, her voice tense. 80/50 and falling. The team paused briefly to prepare additional equipment, leaving Thomas alone for a crucial moment. In that window of vulnerability, a shadow slipped through the door. Magnus Harrison, his face weathered by years, but still carrying that same cruel smile that had haunted Thomas's childhood nightmares. Magnus approached the operating table, his footsteps silent on the cold floor. He leaned close to Thomas's ear, his whisper dripping with malice. "Look at you now, boy." The great Thomas Mitchell, helpless as a child again. Just like that Christmas night when you ran away. His fingers traced the edge of the operating table. "You thought taking Sarah from me would win you redemption? You've only made things worse. When you're gone, everything you built will be mine through her." Thomas's unconscious mind registered the voice, triggering a surge in his heart rate. The monitors beeped frantically as memories flooded his sedated consciousness, the sound of breaking glass, his mother's screams, the cold snow under his bare feet as he fled into the darkness. "I'll make sure you don't survive this," Magnus continued, his voice hardening. "And Sarah, she'll learn what real suffering means. Your death will be just the beginning." Footsteps in the hallway sent Magnus retreating into the shadows. The surgical team rushed back in, responding to the alarming vitals. "We're losing him," the surgeon called out. "Start cardiac support now." As they fought to save Thomas's life, his mind drifted between past and present, between the terror of that Christmas night and the fear for Sarah's future. Even in unconsciousness, one thought burned through his mind: he had to survive not for himself, but for her. The monitors continued their frantic warning, a mechanical chorus accompanying the silent battle between life and death, between past demons and future hopes, as the surgery that would determine not just one but two fates continued under the harsh operating room lights. Thank you for sharing this moment with us. Your support through subscribing means the world. It helps us continue creating meaningful stories that touch hearts and inspire change. Together, we can share more powerful narratives that remind us of the strength of human connection. The story of Thomas Mitchell's ascent from a traumatized orphan to a millionaire CEO was one marked by determination, pain, and carefully constructed walls. After escaping his father's brutality that fateful Christmas night, 10-year-old Thomas found himself at Santa Esperanza Community Shelter, carrying nothing but invisible scars and a burning desire to ensure he would never be vulnerable again. In the shelter, Thomas learned his first lesson about survival. Emotions were a luxury he couldn't afford. While other children sought comfort in shared activities and friendships, he immersed himself in books and numbers, finding solace in their predictable patterns. The shelter's caretaker, Mrs. Reynolds, recognized something different in him: not just pain, but a fierce intelligence that seemed to burn brighter with each hardship. Through Mrs. Reynolds' guidance, Thomas excelled academically, earning scholarships that paved his way through business school. He worked multiple jobs, sleeping barely 4 hours a night, driving himself with an intensity that both impressed and worried his professors. But behind his academic achievements, the wounds of his past festered. Every Christmas season he would disappear entirely, drowning himself in extra work to avoid the memories that threatened to surface. His first business venture came from identifying a market gap in sustainable design. Thomas saw beauty in broken things, in materials others had discarded, perhaps because he recognized himself in them. He started small, repurposing industrial waste into high-end furniture. His unique vision and ruthless work ethic quickly caught investors' attention. By 30, Thomas had built Mitchell Enterprises into a $1 million company. His employees saw him as brilliant but brutal, a perfectionist who demanded excellence with the same fervor he demanded it from himself. Few understood that his harsh exterior was a fortress built brick by brick, protecting the vulnerable child who still lived within. The media painted him as a self-made success story, the orphan who had conquered adversity through sheer will. They praised his business acumen, his innovative approach to sustainable design, his philanthropic donations to children's causes, though he always refused to attend the charity galas. What they didn't see were the sleepless nights, the panic attacks he carefully hid, the way he flinched at sudden movements or the sound of breaking glass. In his penthouse office overlooking the city, Thomas surrounded himself with modern art and minimalist furniture, everything controlled, everything perfect. But in his private moments he would sometimes touch the small scar on his palm, a reminder of that Christmas night when everything shattered. He kept a single photo hidden in his desk drawer, himself as a child with his mother, both smiling at a Christmas tree. It was the only evidence he allowed himself of a time when he knew how to smile without calculation, how to love without fear. His wealth brought him power, respect, and a measure of security he had desperately craved as a child. Yet success, he discovered, was an ineffective bandage for wounds that had never properly healed. Each Christmas bonus he signed came with memories of gifts he never received. Each corporate dinner reminded him of hungry nights. Each handshake with a business partner required suppressing the instinct to flinch from human contact. The business world celebrated Thomas Mitchell as a visionary leader who transformed tragedy into triumph. But alone in his vast, empty home, surrounded by the trappings of success, Thomas remained that frightened boy running through the snow, forever trying to escape shadows that grew longer with each passing year. His rise to wealth and power wasn't just a story of ambition fulfilled, it was a fortress built to protect a heart that had never stopped bleeding. Thomas Mitchell's aversion to Christmas manifested in ways that went beyond mere dislike. As December approached each year, his employees learned to brace themselves for his increasingly rigid demands and hair-trigger temper. The mere sight of holiday decorations in the office lobby could send him into a cold fury that left even the most seasoned executives trembling. His executive assistant had once made the mistake of placing a small poinsettia on her desk. Thomas had stopped mid-stride, his face draining of color before hardening into a mask of controlled rage. "Remove it," he had said, his voice carrying the chill of a winter storm. "This is a place of business, not a seasonal carnival." The plant disappeared, along with any other hint of festive spirit in the office. The company's annual December meetings became notorious for their brutality. Thomas would dissect every project, every number, with a precision that seemed designed to wound rather than improve. "If you have time to think about holidays," he would say, his voice carrying years of unspoken pain, "you're not working hard enough." His coldness peaked during Christmas week when other companies were winding down for celebrations. Mitchell Enterprises remained operational at full capacity, with Thomas himself working longer hours than usual. He would pace the empty corridors late into the night, as if haunted by ghosts only he could see. Even his rare acts of generosity carried a stark, anti-festive message. The year-end bonuses were always distributed in January, never December. Company donations to children's charities came with strict stipulations that they not be used for Christmas celebrations. His employees whispered about it, creating theories about their boss's peculiar behavior. In client meetings during the holiday season, Thomas was particularly merciless. He would schedule them at odd hours, demanding presentations be stripped of any seasonal references. Once, when a major client innocently wished him Merry Christmas. After signing a contract, Thomas had stared at them with such intensity that the room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. His personal life reflected this same frozen wasteland. His mansion, though impeccably decorated, never saw a Christmas tree or a single strand of lights. He deliberately scheduled business trips during the holidays, preferring the anonymity of foreign hotels where he could ignore the festivities entirely. The household staff knew better than to even mention the holiday in his presence. The few who had worked with him long enough recognized the pain beneath his icy exterior. They noticed how his hands would tremble slightly at the sound of Christmas carols drifting from nearby buildings, how he would take alternate routes to avoid streets decorated with holiday lights. His reaction wasn't mere dislike, it was the response of someone running from memories that threatened to consume him. What they couldn't see were his private moments of vulnerability, the nights when the sound of breaking glass in a restaurant would send him into a panic attack he had to hide in the restroom. The way he avoided mirrors during December, unable to face the shadow of the frightened boy still visible in his eyes. The nightmares that intensified during the holiday season, leaving him gasping awake in his empty bedroom, the echo of his mother's screams still ringing in his ears. Year after year, Thomas built his walls higher, his demeanor colder, his hatred of Christmas more intense. It became more than a quirk of a demanding boss. It was his shield, his armor against a past that refused to stay buried. The holiday season wasn't just a time of celebration he chose to ignore. It was a battlefield he had to survive, again and again, each year adding new layers to the fortress around his heart. Mitchell Enterprises operated like a perfectly calibrated machine, each component functioning under the weight of Thomas Mitchell's exacting standards. The 60-story glass building in downtown Manhattan housed an environment where excellence wasn't just expected, it was the baseline for survival. Employees quickly learned that mediocrity was a cardinal sin, and mistakes were unforgivable transgressions. The office culture was defined by an almost military precision. Meetings started exactly on time. Anyone arriving even 30 seconds late found themselves locked out, facing the consequences of their negligence later. Reports required triple checking before submission, as Thomas was known to fire people for single typos in crucial documents. The pressure created an atmosphere where people spoke in hushed tones and walked quickly through corridors as if trying to avoid drawing attention to themselves. Each floor operated under strict protocols. The design department, despite creating innovative, sustainable products, worked in an environment that discouraged creative chaos. Desks remained meticulously organized, mood boards were geometric and precise, and even color swatches had to be arranged in perfect chromatic order. Personal items were discouraged, family photos or decorative items were seen as distractions from professional excellence. The Human Resources Department had developed an infamous orientation process. New employees received a 100-page manual of protocols, each rule reflecting Thomas's personal philosophy of precision and control. The dress code was rigidly enforced, subtle grays and blues only, with even the shade of black suits regulated to maintain uniformity. HR managers spoke in carefully measured tones about maintaining standards while conveying the underlying message: adapt or leave. Interdepartmental communication followed strict hierarchies. Junior employees couldn't directly approach senior management without going through proper channels. Email protocols required specific subject line formats, and response times were monitored. The IT department maintained logs of every digital interaction, creating a web of surveillance that kept everyone in line. Yet, paradoxically, the company's external reputation soared. Mitchell Enterprises led the industry in sustainable design innovations, consistently topped best places to work lists for its exceptional benefits, and maintained an impressive record of promoting from within. The outside world saw only the results: groundbreaking products, impressive profit margins, and a workforce that appeared supremely professional. What remained hidden was the cost of this success. The company therapist office, discreetly located on the top floor, had a waiting list of employees dealing with anxiety and stress-related issues. The turnover rate in junior positions was high, though this was masked by careful HR management. Those who survived the first year often developed a kind of Stockholm syndrome, defending the rigid culture to newcomers while nursing their own private wounds. Thomas maintained his control through a combination of fear and rewards. Top performers received generous bonuses and promotions, creating fierce competition among colleagues. But one mistake could erase years of achievement, leading to a culture where people worked late into the night, double and triple checking their work, afraid of becoming the next cautionary tale. The cafeteria, despite its high-end facilities, was rarely full. People ate at their desks, using lunch hours to get ahead on work. The few who dared to form social connections did so cautiously, away from the office, aware that too much fraternization was viewed as a distraction from professional duties. This was the ecosystem Thomas had created, a place where excellence bred success, but humanity was carefully regulated. The irony that escaped him was how his attempt to create perfect order had instead manufactured an environment that mirrored his own internal chaos. His employees, like him, wore masks of composure while navigating a minefield of triggers and expectations, all striving to meet standards set by a man who had never learned to forgive himself for being human. The incident that would change everything at Mitchell Enterprises began 5 days before Christmas. Emma Richardson, a senior designer who had survived 6 years under Thomas's leadership, made what she believed was a harmless decision. She and a group of employees had organized a small, discreet Christmas charity drive for local orphaned children, planning to collect donations during lunch breaks. The morning started like any other. Thomas arrived at exactly 7:30 a.m., his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor of the lobby. But as the elevator doors opened to the executive floor, he froze. Through the glass walls of the conference room, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Employees gathering around a small table decorated with modest Christmas ornaments, sorting wrapped presents. For a moment he stood motionless, his hand gripping his leather briefcase so tightly his knuckles turned white. The scene before him triggered a cascade of memories, wrapped presents burning in a fireplace, a child's hopes shattering like ornaments thrown against a wall. His breathing became shallow, his vision narrowing to a tunnel of rage. "What is the meaning of this?" His voice cut through the morning chatter like a blade. The room fell silent instantly. Emma stepped forward, her confidence bolstered by years of excellent performance reviews. "Mr. Mitchell, we're collecting gifts for children at the Santa Esperanza shelter. Many of them have never—" The Santa Esperanza shelter. Thomas's voice cracked slightly, a detail noticed only by those closest to him. That name, the same shelter that had taken him in decades ago, hit him like a physical blow. But his employees saw only the fury that followed. "Everyone in this room is fired," he announced, his tone as cold as winter frost. "Clear out your desks within the hour. Security will escort you out." The silence that followed was deafening. 28 employees, some who had been with the company for years, stood frozen in disbelief. "But Sir," Emma protested, "these children have nothing. We were just trying to—" Thomas turned to her, his eyes blazing with an intensity that made her step back. "You think charity excuses insubordination? You think good intentions justify turning my company into a playground? Pack your things. All of you, now." The scene that followed was chaos contained within perfect order, exactly how Thomas preferred his disasters. Security guards appeared as if summoned by his rage. Professional movers arrived with boxes. HR representatives materialized with termination papers, their faces carefully neutral as they processed the mass firing with mechanical efficiency. Emma watched as her colleagues packed years of their lives into cardboard boxes. Family photos, awards, certificates of achievement, all carefully wrapped and labeled, just as they'd wrapped the presents for children they'd never meet. Some cried silently at their desks. Others moved in shocked silence. A few tried to protest, pointing out the illegality of mass termination, but Thomas's legal team was already prepared with severance packages and non-disclosure agreements. As employees filed out of the building, their personal belongings clutched in boxes, Thomas stood in his office, staring out at the winter sky. He had won, hadn't he? He had maintained order, prevented weakness, protected his company from the disorder of sentiment. Yet why did victory taste like ashes in his mouth? The presents collected for the shelter sat abandoned in the conference room, their cheerful wrapping paper now seeming to mock the desolation around them. Thomas ordered them removed, but stopped the security guard who was about to throw them in the dumpster. To send them to the shelter, he commanded, his voice rough. Anonymously, it was the only concession he allowed himself. By evening, the office was eerily silent. 28 desks sat empty, their surfaces wiped clean of any trace of the lives that had occupied them just hours before. Thomas walked through the quiet space, telling himself this was better, cleaner, safer. But with each step he heard the echoes of another time, another place, a little boy alone in a shelter at Christmas, wishing someone, anyone, would remember he existed. He reached for his phone, his finger hovering over the number for his assistant. He could fix this, recall them all, blame it on stress, on a momentary lapse in judgment. But his pride, his fear, his carefully constructed walls wouldn't allow it. Instead, he straightened his tie, squared his shoulders, and did what he had learned to do best. He buried his emotions under layers of cold professionalism and walked away, leaving behind not just 28 employees, but another piece of his humanity. 2 days after the mass firing, Thomas found himself walking through the snow-covered streets of Manhattan, the evening darkness settling around him like a familiar cloak. He had stayed late at the office, avoiding the whispers and stares that had followed the Christmas party incident. The cold December air bit at his face, but he welcomed the physical discomfort. It was easier to handle than the emotional turmoil he refused to acknowledge. At the corner of Fifth Avenue he saw her. A small figure huddled against the cold, no more than 12 years old, holding out a tin can with trembling hands. Her coat was too thin for the weather, her shoes worn and inadequate for the snow. But it was her eyes that stopped Thomas in his tracks, large, brown, and haunted by a pain he recognized all too well. "Please," so she whispered, her voice barely audible above the winter wind. Anything helps, Thomas meant to walk past, just as he had passed countless others, but something about her made him pause. Perhaps it was the way she flinched when a man walked too close, or how she kept glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. "What's your name?" he found himself asking, surprising both of them. The girl hesitated, clearly weighing whether to trust him. "Sarah," she finally answered, her voice carrying a trace of defiance beneath the fear. Sarah Harrison, the last name, sent an unexpected chill through Thomas, one that had nothing to do with the December cold. He noticed the bruises then, partially hidden by her collar. The slight tremor in her hands wasn't just from cold, it was from terror. The same terror he had known decades ago. "Where do you live, Sarah?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral despite the growing unease in his chest. Her answer was vague, evasive, but her eyes darted toward the poorer section of town. "My father. He sent me to get money," she explained, the word father coming out wrong, twisted, just as it had when Thomas himself had spoken it years ago. "If I don't bring enough back," she left the sentence unfinished, but Thomas heard the ending in his own memories. Against his better judgment, against all the walls he had built, Thomas found himself kneeling to her level. Snow soaked through his expensive suit pants, but he barely noticed. Up close, he saw the details his wealthy clients would have missed: the careful way she held herself to minimize pain from hidden injuries, the slight scar near her temple that spoke of accidents that were anything but accidental. "Your father," Thomas said carefully. "What's his name?" The girl's face closed off immediately, fear replacing everything else. "Harrison," she whispered, "but he changed it. It used to be something else." Thomas felt his heart stop for a moment. "Magnus?" he asked, the name tasting like poison on his tongue. Sarah's eyes widened in recognition and terror. At that moment, a distant shout made her jump. "I have to go," she said, panic evident in her voice. "He'll be looking for me. I can't be late." She turned to run, but Thomas gently caught her arm. She flinched at the contact, and he immediately released her, recognizing the reaction all too well. "Sarah, wait," he said, pulling out his business card. "If you ever need help, any kind of help, call this number." Day or night, she took the card hesitantly, staring at it as if it might disappear. "Why?" she asked, suspicion warring with desperate hope in her eyes. "Why would you help me?" Thomas stood slowly, brushing snow from his knees. How could he explain that in her? He saw his own past playing out again. That Magnus, the monster who had destroyed his childhood, was somehow still destroying lives. Instead, he simply said, "Because someone should have helped me when I was your age." She studied him for a moment longer, then stuffed the card into her pocket and ran, disappearing into the snowy darkness. Thomas watched her go, feeling the carefully constructed walls of his world beginning to crack. The ghost of his past wasn't just haunting him anymore, it was alive, continuing its cycle of destruction through another innocent life. He pulled out his phone, fingers hovering over the keypad. He could call the police, social services, any number of authorities. But he remembered how little they had helped him, how the system had failed him until that night he had finally run away. No, this required something more direct, something personal. As the snow continued to fall around him, Thomas Mitchell made a decision that would shatter the carefully ordered world he had built for himself. The revelation came 3 days after meeting Sarah on the street. Thomas sat in his private office, surrounded by stacks of papers, background checks, police reports, and old newspaper clippings he'd had his investigators gather. Each document added another piece to a puzzle he hadn't known existed, forming a picture that threatened to shatter his carefully maintained composure. His head investigator, James Porter, stood before his desk. "There's something you need to see." He placed a worn photograph on Thomas's desk. The image showed a young woman, smiling despite a familiar wariness in her eyes. "This is Catherine Mitchell, your sister. She disappeared 15 years ago." Thomas's hands trembled as he picked up the photograph. Katie, his little sister, who had escaped their father's abuse years after he had, who had changed her name and started a new life. The sister he had lost contact with, believing it safer for both of them to remain apart. "She's dead, isn't she?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Porter nodded grimly. "Murdered 13 years ago. The case went cold, but he hesitated, then placed another document on the desk. She had a daughter, a 2-year-old at the time. The father was never in the picture, but after Catherine's death, the child disappeared from the system. Until now." Thomas stared at the birth certificate, his vision blurring. Sarah Catherine Mitchell, his niece. The girl on the street wasn't just another victim of Magnus's cruelty, she was his own flesh and blood. How he managed to ask, his voice rough with emotion. How did Magnus get her? He was working at the children's home where she was placed, Porter explained. Changed his name, created a new identity. Harrison wasn't his first alias. He's been moving from city to city, working in children's services, adopting vulnerable kids. There's a pattern, sir. Sarah isn't the first. The implications hit Thomas like physical blows. Magnus hadn't just continued his cycle of abuse, he had systematically targeted children, including Thomas's own niece. Had he known who Sarah was when he adopted her? Was this his ultimate revenge, destroying Thomas's family without him even knowing? "There's more," Porter continued reluctantly, "about your sister's death. The evidence suggests it wasn't random. The police missed the connection, but looking at the timing, the method he didn't need to finish." Thomas knew. Magnus had found Katie, had taken his revenge on her for escaping, and then had taken her daughter, whether by cruel coincidence or calculated malice. Thomas stood abruptly, walking to the window. The city sprawled below, millions of lives intersecting in countless ways, and somewhere out there his niece was suffering the same nightmare he had escaped decades ago. The same nightmare that had claimed her mother's life. Sir Porter's voice was careful. "What do you want us to do? We have enough evidence to involve the authorities now." Thomas turned back, his face set in lines of determination. The cold, calculating businessman was gone, replaced by something older and more primal, a protector awakened by the call of blood and responsibility. No police. Not yet. Magnus has evaded them before. He has connections, methods of disappearing. If we move too quickly, he'll vanish again, and he'll take Sarah with him. He picked up the photograph of his sister again, tracing her smile with a gentle finger. "Katie," he whispered, "I'm so sorry." I should have been there. I should have protected you both." The guilt threatened to overwhelm him, but he pushed it back. There would be time for grief later. Now was the time for action. "Get me everything," he ordered Porter. Every detail about Magnus's movements over the past 15 years. Every alias, every connection, every child he's come in contact with. I want to know where he goes, what he does, who he talks to. Most importantly, I need to know his routine with Sarah, when he leaves her alone, where he sends her to beg everything. Porter nodded, already making notes. "And Sarah," he asked, "do we make contact?" Thomas shook his head. "Not yet. If Magnus suspects she's talking to anyone, especially me," he left the thought unfinished, remembering his own childhood punishments. "We watch, we gather evidence, and when the moment is right, we get her out. Permanently." As Porter left the office, Thomas remained standing at the window, the photograph of his sister still in his hand. The city lights blurred through unshed tears, but his resolve was clear. He had failed to protect Katie, had let his fear of the past keep him from being the brother she needed. He wouldn't fail Sarah. No matter the cost, no matter the consequences, he would save his niece and finally put an end to the nightmare that had haunted his family for too long. Copyrightory. The night Thomas chose to act came sooner than he had planned. His investigators had been tracking Magnus's movements, building a careful profile of routines and habits, but on a bitter December evening, everything changed. A call came from one of his surveillance team. Sarah had been spotted running through the streets, clearly injured, with Magnus in pursuit. Thomas was in his office when the call came. He didn't hesitate. Gone was the calculated businessman who weighed every decision. In his place stood a man driven by a mixture of rage, protective instinct, and the ghosts of his own past. He grabbed his coat and headed for the elevator, barking orders into his phone. "Keep eyes on her. Do not engage with Magnus." "I'm coming." His driver was already waiting, the car's engine running. As they sped through the city streets, Thomas's mind raced with memories his own escape decades ago, the terror of being hunted, the desperate need to find somewhere, anywhere safe. Through his earpiece he heard the updates. Sarah had ducked into an alley off 43rd Street. Magnus was 2 blocks behind, asking strangers if they'd seen a young girl running past. Thomas directed his driver to circle around, approaching from the opposite direction. He needed to reach Sarah before Magnus did. The car hadn't fully stopped when Thomas jumped out. The winter air hit him like a physical blow, but he barely noticed. He moved through the shadows, guided by instinct and the echo of his own childhood fears. He found her huddled behind a dumpster, shivering violently, her lips split and a bruise darkening on her cheek. "Sarah," he called softly, keeping his distance to avoid frightening her more. She looked up, recognition and fear warring in her eyes. "Mr. Mitchell," her voice was barely a whisper. "He'll find me. He always finds me." Thomas held out his hand, just as he wished someone had done for him all those years ago. "Not this time. I won't let him hurt you anymore." He saw the doubt in her eyes, the same doubt he had carried about every adult who had promised to help. "I know who you are, Sarah. I know who your mother was. My sister, Catherine." Her eyes widened at this revelation, but before she could respond, they heard Magnus's voice echoing off the brick walls. "Sarah, come out now, and maybe I won't break both your arms." The familiar threat in his tone made both Sarah and Thomas flinch, a shared reaction born of shared trauma. "Trust me," Thomas whispered, his hand still extended. "I couldn't save your mother, but I can save you." "Let me try for a moment." Sarah remained frozen, trapped between fear and hope. Then, just as Magnus's footsteps grew closer, she grabbed Thomas's hand. He pulled her up and quickly led her through a maze of alleys, moving with the certainty of someone who had once lived in these shadows. His security team provided updates through his earpiece. Magnus was circling the block, growing more furious with each passing minute. They reached the waiting car just as Magnus's shouts grew dangerously close. Thomas helped Sarah inside, then slid in after her. "Go," he commanded his driver. As they pulled away, he caught a glimpse of Magnus in the rearview mirror, a dark figure standing in the middle of the street, watching their escape with cold fury. Sarah sat rigid beside him, still trembling. Thomas carefully removed his coat and draped it over her shoulders, remembering how long it had taken him to accept kindness after his own escape. "You're safe now," he said quietly. "He won't hurt you again. I promise." She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. "You're like me," she said, not a question but a recognition. "You ran from him too." Thomas nodded, feeling decades of carefully maintained walls beginning to crack. "A long time ago, he was my father before he became your guardian." The car moved swiftly through the city streets, putting distance between them and the monster who had haunted both their lives. Thomas knew this was just the beginning. Magnus wouldn't let go easily. There would be legal battles, investigations, and the long process of healing. But looking at Sarah, seeing Catherine's eyes in her face, he knew he had made the right choice. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, her voice small but steadier now. Thomas thought of his empty mansion, its cold perfection that had never felt like home. "Somewhere safe," he answered. "Somewhere we can both start over." As the city lights blurred past the windows, he silently vowed that this time, things would be different. This time the cycle of abuse would end. The decision to return to Magnus's house wasn't made lightly. After ensuring Sarah was safe at his mansion under heavy security, Thomas knew he needed to gather evidence, documents, photographs, anything that could legally cement his custody of Sarah and bring Magnus to justice. But walking up those creaking steps, he felt like a child again, every shadow holding potential threats. The house was exactly as Sarah had described, a dilapidated two-story structure with peeling paint and windows covered by cardboard. The front door hung slightly askew, its lock broken from years of violent entries and exits. Thomas stood for a moment, his hand on the cold doorknob, memories washing over him like icy water. Inside, the smell hit him first: alcohol, cigarettes, and despair, the same combination that had defined his childhood. Empty bottles littered the floor, their labels matching the brand Magnus had always preferred. Some things never changed. Thomas moved carefully through the darkness, his flashlight beam revealing layers of neglect and abuse. He found Sarah's room, easily a small space with a bare mattress and walls covered in crayon drawings. Looking closer, he realized they weren't just drawings, they were escape plans, carefully disguised as childish art. Routes through the neighborhood, safe places to hide, just as he had once mapped out his own escape routes. Sentimental fool Magnus's voice cut through the darkness. Thomas spun around to find his father standing in the doorway, blocking the exit. Coming back to the scene of the crime. The older man's face was twisted in a familiar sneer, though time had carved deeper lines of cruelty around his mouth. Thomas straightened, forcing himself to meet those cold eyes. "The only crimes here are yours," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'm taking Sarah away from you." Permanently, he reached into his pocket, gripping the phone that was secretly recording everything. Magnus laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the bare walls. "Take her, like you took everything else from me. My reputation, my power, my control." He stepped into the room, his movements predatory. "You were always weak, Thomas, running away instead of taking your punishment like a man, and now you think you can play hero." "I was a child," Thomas responded, his voice gaining strength. "Sarah is a child. You're nothing but a coward who preys on those weaker than yourself." He saw the rage flash in Magnus's eyes, the same look that had preceded so many childhood beatings. "A coward," Magnus spat the word. "I made you strong. Everything you are today you owe to me. Without my lessons you'd be nothing." He reached for something behind his back, and Thomas tensed, ready for violence. Instead, Magnus pulled out an old photograph. Thomas recognized it instantly. His mother smiling at the camera, unaware it would be her last Christmas. She was weak too, Magnus said, his voice dripping with contempt. Just like your sister. Just like Sarah. Women who need to be taught their place. The mention of Catherine ignited something in Thomas. You killed her, he said, the words burning in his throat. My sister. Sarah's mother. It wasn't random violence. It was you. The smile that spread across Magnus's face confirmed everything. Katie needed a lesson in respect, Magnus said casually, as if discussing the weather. Just like her daughter needs now. But you had to interfere, just like you always did. He took another step forward, his hands clenching into fists. Thomas stood his ground, though every instinct screamed at him to run. It ends here, he said firmly. The abuse, the control, all of it. I'm not that frightened boy anymore, and you're not the monster I once thought you were. You're just a bitter old man who can only feel powerful by hurting children. Magnus moved with surprising speed for his age, swinging a fist at Thomas's head. But Thomas had anticipated this, had spent years anticipating this moment. He dodged the blow, using Magnus's momentum against him. The older man stumbled, crashing into the wall. I've called the police, Thomas said, backing toward the door. They'll find everything they need here. Sarah's medical records, Katie's murder weapon, evidence of your other victims. It's over, Magnus. The look of pure hatred on his father's face would once have terrified him. Now it only strengthened his resolve. You think you've won, Magnus snarled, struggling to his feet. This isn't over. It will never be over. You're mine, Thomas. You'll always be mine. And Sarah, she'll learn the same lesson you never did. But his threats sounded hollow now, desperate rather than powerful. Thomas heard sirens in the distance, growing closer. No, he said simply. We're not yours anymore. We never were. He turned his back on Magnus, the hardest and most liberating action of his life, and walked out of that house of horrors, leaving his father's rage-filled shouts behind. The media storm broke the next morning with devastating force. Business mogul kidnaps child screamed the headlines, accompanied by security camera footage of Thomas leading Sarah to his car. Local news stations ran continuous coverage, painting him as a predator who had used his wealth and influence to snatch a child from her loving father. Magnus, it seemed, had prepared for this possibility. He appeared on every major network, playing the role of devastated parent perfectly. She's my little girl, he sobbed into cameras, his performance flawless. He took her from me just because he could. Because he's rich and powerful and thinks he can do whatever he wants. The public ate it up. The story of a wealthy tyrant stealing from a humble single father resonated deeply. Thomas's reputation, already damaged by the mass Christmas firing, crumbled further. Protesters gathered outside Mitchell Enterprises, holding signs condemning child trafficking. His board of directors called an emergency meeting, discussing the possibility of forcing him to step down. Even his most loyal employees began to doubt, wondering if they had missed signs of darkness in their demanding boss. The child services investigation seemed biased from the start. Magnus had connections there built over years of working in the system, and they appeared more interested in rushing Sarah back to her father than investigating Thomas's claims of abuse. When Thomas presented evidence of Sarah's injuries, they dismissed them as normal childhood accidents. Mr. Mitchell, the lead investigator, said during a particularly tense meeting, your own history of erratic behavior, particularly your recent mass firing over Christmas decorations, suggests emotional instability. How can we be sure this isn't some sort of psychological break? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Sarah's school turned against him too. Teachers who had ignored her bruises and withdrawn behavior for months suddenly became vocal advocates for her return to Magnus. Mr. Harrison is a devoted father, the principal insisted to reporters. He volunteers at school events, helps with fundraisers. Mr. Mitchell, on the other hand, is a known recluse with a history of aggressive behavior. The final blow came from his own security team. Under pressure from the investigation, several guards gave statements suggesting Thomas had been stalking Sarah for weeks before the kidnapping. They didn't mention they had been part of his surveillance operation to protect her. Fear of legal repercussions made them protect themselves instead. Even the homeless community, who had witnessed Sarah begging on the streets, turned against him. Magnus had cultivated relationships there too, occasionally offering food and blankets, building an image of a struggling father doing his best. He always made sure she was warm, one street vendor told reporters, conveniently forgetting the times Sarah had huddled in the cold, terrified to return home empty-handed. Thomas found himself increasingly isolated. His lawyers advised him to return Sarah immediately to minimize the legal consequences. His Puerto Rico team suggested a public apology and some story about temporary insanity brought on by holiday stress. Even Porter, his head investigator, warned him that the evidence against Magnus might not be enough given the older man's carefully constructed public image. But in his mansion's secure wing, where Sarah slowly began to feel safe enough to sleep through the night, Thomas knew he couldn't give in. He watched as she gradually stopped flinching at sudden movements, as she began to eat regular meals without hiding food in her pockets. As the haunted look in her eyes began to fade, these small signs of healing meant more than any public opinion. One evening, as protesters chanted outside his gates, Sarah found him in his study. "They all believe him," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "Just like they always did. Nobody ever saw what he really was." Thomas knelt beside her, seeing in her face the same fear and frustration he had felt as a child. "Some people find it easier to believe a comfortable lie than an uncomfortable truth," he told her gently. "But we know the truth, Sarah, and I promise you, no matter what anyone says or believes, I will not let him hurt you again." She studied his face for a long moment, then did something that made all the public condemnation worthwhile. She hugged him, trusting him to keep her safe. Later that night, watching the latest news coverage of Magnus's tearful pleas for his daughter's return, Thomas made a decision. If the world wanted to believe he was a monster, so be it. He had spent his life building walls to protect himself. Now those walls would protect Sarah too. The truth would come out eventually, but until then he would bear any burden necessary to keep her safe from the real monster who had destroyed both their childhoods. The first signs of Thomas's failing health appeared subtly, like shadows lengthening before dusk. The constant pressure of protecting Sarah, while fighting legal battles and managing his company's crisis, began to take its toll. At first it was just shortness of breath climbing the mansion's stairs, a tightness in his chest he attributed to stress. During a particularly heated meeting with his lawyers, Thomas felt a sharp pain shoot down his left arm. He dismissed it, focusing instead on the custody battle strategies. Sarah needed him strong, and weakness wasn't an option. But his body had other plans. Late at night, when the mansion was quiet except for the footsteps of security guards, the pain would return with growing intensity. Dr. Eleanor Matthews, his personal physician, arrived for what was supposed to be a routine checkup and immediately recognized the severity of his condition. "Your heart is failing, Thomas," she said bluntly, reviewing his test results. "The stress, the lack of rest, the constant tension, it's killing you. You need immediate surgery." Thomas sat in his study, the medical reports spread before him like a death sentence. Surgery meant vulnerability. Time in the hospital meant leaving Sarah unprotected. "How long can I wait?" he asked, his voice rough. Dr. Matthews shook her head, her expression grave. "You're asking the wrong question. It's not about how long you can wait, it's about how long you want Sarah to have a guardian." That evening, he found Sarah in the library, curled up with a book. She looked up as he entered, and he saw how much healthier she appeared after just weeks away from Magnus. The bruises had faded, she had gained weight, and her eyes held a spark of life that had been missing before. The sight made his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with his heart condition. "Sarah," he said, sitting beside her, "we need to talk about something important." He explained about his heart, trying to minimize the severity while being honest enough to prepare her. He watched her face crumple, saw the old fear return to her eyes. "You can't leave me," she whispered, gripping his hand. "He'll come back. He always comes back." The surgery was scheduled for the following week. Thomas worked tirelessly to prepare, setting up additional security measures, arranging for trusted staff to care for Sarah, and putting legal safeguards in place in case the worst happened. Each preparation felt like a weight on his failing heart, but he forced himself to continue. His symptoms worsened rapidly. One morning, while reviewing security footage, he collapsed in his office. His security chief found him clutching his chest, his breathing shallow and labored. Sarah, hearing the commotion, ran in before anyone could stop her. The look of terror on her face as she saw him on the floor haunted him more than any physical pain. "I'm fine," he tried to assure her, even as the room spun around him. Just tired, but Sarah, wise beyond her years from too much trauma, saw through the lie. That night, she slipped into his study, carrying a cup of tea. "Mum used to make this when I was sick," she said quietly, placing it before him. The simple gesture of care, from a child who had known so little of it, nearly broke him. The night before his surgery, Thomas couldn't sleep. He stood at his window, watching the security teams patrol the grounds, thinking of all the ways things could go wrong. A soft knock at his door revealed Sarah, also sleepless. "Can I stay here for a while?" she asked, her voice small. They sat together in comfortable silence, both fighting their own fears. "I found this," Sarah said suddenly, pulling a folded paper from her pocket. It was a photograph. Thomas recognized it immediately. His sister Catherine, holding baby Sarah, both smiling at the camera. "Mom kept it hidden from him," said it was from happier times. Thomas felt tears burn his eyes. "She loved you so much, Sarah? Just like I do." The admission surprised them both. Love wasn't a word either of them used easily, their experiences with Magnus having poisoned even that most basic human emotion. But in that moment, facing the uncertainty of the surgery, the truth came out naturally. Sarah curled closer to him, and he felt her tears soaking into his shirt. "I can't lose another parent," she whispered. "Please come back." The word parent hit him hard. Despite all his efforts to protect her, he hadn't realized he'd become more than just a guardian. As dawn approached, Thomas felt the pain in his chest intensify. Each breath became a struggle, but he refused to move, letting Sarah sleep against him. He thought about the irony of his situation. His heart was failing physically, just as it was finally healing emotionally. The walls he had built so carefully over the years had crumbled, not from Magnus's violence or the world's condemnation, but from the simple trust of a wounded child. Dr. Matthews arrived early, taking in the scene with understanding eyes. "It's time," she said softly. Sarah woke, immediately alert, as all abuse survivors learn to be. Thomas hugged her one last time, trying to memorize everything: her warmth, her trust, the way she clung to him as if her grip alone could keep him safe. "I'll come back," he promised, his voice rough with emotion and pain. "You're not alone anymore, Sarah." Never again. As the medical team helped him to the waiting ambulance, he saw her watching from the window, her hand pressed against the glass. The same way he had watched his mother for the last time, so many years ago. The pain in his chest was constant now, each heartbeat a reminder of what he stood to lose. But as the ambulance pulled away from the mansion, Thomas felt something he hadn't expected: peace. Whatever happened in surgery, he had finally done something right. He had broken the cycle of abuse, had shown Sarah that love didn't have to hurt. If these were his last acts, they were worthy ones. The revelation began with a letter. It arrived at Mitchell Enterprises 3 days after Thomas's surgery admission, addressed simply for Sarah Harrison about Magnus. The security team almost dismissed it as fan mail or press intrusion, but something about the careful handwriting made them pass it to Porter for investigation. Inside was a story that would crack the foundations of Magnus's carefully constructed facade. The writer, Emily Parker, had been one of his daughters 15 years ago. She detailed systematic abuse, manipulation, and terror that mirrored Sarah's experiences exactly. But more importantly, she provided names, dozens of them. Other children Magnus had adopted and broken under different aliases. Porter began reaching out, carefully and discreetly. Each contact revealed another victim, another story, another piece of Magnus's dark legacy. Jenny Thompson, now a nurse in Boston, who still couldn't sleep with her bedroom door closed. Michael Rivera, a teacher in Chicago who flinched at the sound of breaking glass. Each survivor carried their own scars, their own versions of the same nightmare. The stories followed a pattern. Magnus would appear in a new city, usually after a tragedy or scandal forced him to flee his previous identity. He'd work his way into child services or similar positions, building a reputation as a dedicated advocate for troubled children. Then he'd identify the most vulnerable, those without family connections, those already traumatized, those least likely to be believed. He knew exactly what to say to the authorities, wrote Rebecca Chen, now a successful attorney. He'd tell them how he wanted to give us a better life, how he had such a big heart for troubled children. Nobody looked too closely at his background. Nobody wondered why he moved so often. Nobody asked why his adopted children kept running away. The most devastating testimony came from twins, James and Julia Wilson. Magnus had separated them immediately after adoption, using their fear for each other's safety to ensure compliance. He'd tell me Julia was locked in the basement, James wrote. He'd say if I didn't do exactly what he wanted, he'd hurt her worse than he hurt me. I didn't know he was telling her the same lies about me. As the stories accumulated, patterns emerged that matched Thomas's own childhood experiences. The Christmas trauma was a recurring theme. Magnus seemed to take particular pleasure in destroying holiday celebrations, using the season of joy to inflict his deepest wounds. Several survivors mentioned similar incidents, with Christmas trees being destroyed, presents being burned, decorations being used as weapons. More disturbing were the financial aspects that surfaced. Magnus had systematically drained trust funds, inheritance money and insurance payouts meant for his adopted children. He had developed a network of corrupt officials who helped him navigate the system, changing identities and locations whenever suspicions arose. Sarah, watching the investigation unfold from the safety of Thomas's mansion, began to understand she wasn't alone. Porter arranged secure video calls with other survivors, carefully monitored to ensure they wouldn't overwhelm her. The connections formed in these meetings proved healing for everyone involved. He made us feel so isolated, one survivor told Sarah, like we were the only ones who'd ever experienced his kind of evil. But look at us now, we're an army, and we're not afraid anymore. The strength in these words seemed to awaken something in Sarah. She began sharing her own stories, adding her voice to the growing chorus demanding justice. Legal teams working pro bono began building cases in multiple jurisdictions. Child Services launched internal investigations, uncovering decades of overlooked red flags and ignored warnings. Journalists, sensing a story bigger than the kidnapping, the narrative they'd initially pursued, started digging deeper into Magnus's past. The most shocking discovery came from an unexpected source. A retired detective recognized Magnus's pattern from an unsolved series of cases in the 1980s. Before he'd started adopting children, Magnus had worked as a handyman, targeting single mothers with young children. The detective had suspected him in several disappearances but could never prove anything. Now, with the new evidence and testimony, cold cases were being reopened. Thomas, recovering in his hospital bed, received daily updates about the investigation. Each new revelation confirmed what he'd always known: Magnus wasn't just an abusive father, he was a calculating predator who had spent decades perfecting his methods. The thought that he had almost escaped justice again, almost managed to keep Sarah trapped in his web of abuse, made Thomas's heart monitor spike dangerously. But with each new survivor who came forward, the wall of silence Magnus had built began to crumble. His carefully maintained image of a devoted father fighting against a wealthy kidnapper transformed into something darker and more truthful. The same media outlets that had condemned Thomas now began questioning their rush to judgment, asking harder questions about Magnus's past and his relationships with his children. The survivors, emboldened by their growing numbers, formed a support network. They shared resources, recommended therapists, and most importantly, helped each other heal. Sarah, though one of the youngest, became a symbol of hope, proof that escape was possible, that healing could begin, that the cycle could be broken. And in their collective strength, they found something Magnus had tried to steal from all of them: family. Not the twisted version he had created, built on fear and control, but something real and supportive, founded on shared understanding and genuine care. Together, they were rewriting their story, transforming from victims into survivors, from isolated targets into a united force for change. The transformation of Mitchell Enterprises began with a simple email sent from Thomas's hospital bed to every employee he had fired over the Christmas charity incident. "I was wrong," it read. "Not just about the firing, but about everything. I let my past trauma blind me to your humanity. If you're willing to return, your positions are open with back pay and a formal apology." But Emma Richardson, the senior designer who had organized the ill-fated charity drive, was the first to respond. Her reply was brief but powerful. "We know about Sarah now. We understand. And we want to help." Within days, the office began to fill again, but this time with a different energy. The returning employees brought with them not just their professional skills, but a new sense of purpose. The company's focus shifted organically. The Sustainable Design Division, under Emma's leadership, began developing products specifically for children's shelters and abuse recovery centers. Engineers who had once designed luxury furniture now created secure spaces that could help traumatized children feel safe. Marketing teams that had previously targeted wealthy clients now worked on campaigns to raise awareness about child abuse and trafficking. Word spread through the business community about the changes at Mitchell Enterprises. Some board members initially resisted, concerned about profit margins and market share. But when the first quarter results showed increased productivity and employee engagement, even the most skeptical directors had to acknowledge that something remarkable was happening. The employees who had witnessed Thomas's transformation from cruel taskmaster to protective guardian felt personally invested in the company's new mission. They organized support groups, volunteered at shelters, and used their professional skills to help abuse survivors rebuild their lives. The rigid hierarchy that had once defined the company culture gave way to collaborative teams united by a common cause. The Christmas charity drive that had once cost them their jobs became an annual tradition, expanding beyond gift giving to include year-round support for children in crisis. The conference room where Thomas had fired them now served as a meeting space for survivor support groups after hours. The cold, corporate environment transformed into a community hub for healing and hope. Perhaps the most significant change came in the company's hiring practices. Mitchell Enterprises began actively recruiting abuse survivors, providing them with job training, counseling support, and career development opportunities. The workplace that had once demanded perfection now emphasized growth, understanding, and second chances. Emma, promoted to Director of Community Engagement, implemented policies that would have been unthinkable under the old regime. Flexible hours for employees dealing with trauma recovery, on-site counseling services, but a dedicated fund for emergency housing and legal support for employees escaping abuse. Each initiative reflected the lessons learned from Thomas and Sarah's story. The company's annual Christmas party, once banned under threat of termination, became a celebration of transformation and hope. Instead of corporate gift exchanges, employees contributed to funds supporting abuse survivors. The office decorations now included a tree of hope covered with messages of encouragement from survivors who had rebuilt their lives with the company's help. Even the building itself underwent changes. The stark, minimalist design gave way to warmer, more welcoming spaces. The security team, once focused solely on protecting corporate assets, now included specialists in trauma-informed care and child protection. The lobby, previously a monument to corporate success, displayed artwork created by children in recovery programs. Thomas, watching from his hospital bed as Porter updated him on the company's evolution, felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The walls he had built, both literal and metaphorical, were being transformed into bridges. His employees weren't just workers anymore, they were partners in a mission larger than profit margins and market share. The media, initially skeptical of the company's transformation, began reporting on its innovative approach to corporate social responsibility. Business schools studied the Mitchell model of integrated support for trauma survivors. Other companies started implementing similar programs, creating a ripple effect of positive change throughout the corporate world. But perhaps the most profound change was visible in the day-to-day interactions within the company. The fear and tension that had once permeated every meeting and deadline was replaced by genuine collaboration and support. Employees who had once competed ruthlessly now looked out for each other, recognizing signs of stress or trauma and offering help before it was asked for. When Sarah visited the office for the first time, escorted by her security team, she found not a cold corporate fortress but a community of people committed to preventing other children from experiencing what she had endured. The employees who greeted her weren't just being polite to the boss's ward, they were welcoming a fellow survivor whose story had helped them find their own purpose. Thomas's company had always been successful by traditional metrics, but now it was something more. It was becoming a force for healing, a proof that even the deepest wounds could be transformed into sources of strength and positive change. The transformation wasn't just about business practices or corporate culture, it was about recognizing that every person's story mattered. And that true success meant helping others write better endings to their own stories. The day of Thomas's surgery dawned cold and grey. Security at the mansion was at its highest level, with teams of guards patrolling the perimeter and monitoring every entrance. Sarah, unable to sleep, watched the sun rise from the library window, clutching the photograph of her mother that had become her talisman. Magnus made his move during the critical hours of Thomas's operation. He had spent weeks studying the mansion's security patterns, finding the one weakness in their seemingly impenetrable defense: the underground service tunnel, a relic from the house's construction that wasn't on any modern blueprints. While everyone's attention was focused on Thomas's surgery, Magnus slipped in through this forgotten entrance. The first sign that something was wrong came when the security cameras in the East Wing went dark. The head of security, James Morrison, immediately dispatched a team to investigate. But Magnus had anticipated this, creating diversions at multiple points around the property. As guards rushed to investigate apparent breaches at the gates, he moved silently through the mansion's service corridors. Sarah was in the library speaking to Porter via video call about the latest developments in the investigation against Magnus when the power flickered. Her security detail moved closer, hands on their weapons, but the backup generators kicked in almost immediately. The momentary darkness, however, was all Magnus needed. A smoke bomb rolled into the room, filling the air with thick, disorienting fumes. In the chaos that followed, Magnus emerged wearing a gas mask, moving with the efficiency of someone who had planned this moment meticulously. The security guards, trained for many scenarios but handicapped by their need to protect Sarah, found themselves outmaneuvered in the confined space. "Hello, sweetheart," Magnus's voice came through the mask, that familiar tone that had haunted Sarah's nightmares. "Did you miss Daddy?" Sarah tried to run, but the smoke made it impossible to see the exits. She felt his hand close around her arm with that terrible familiar grip, and suddenly she was 8 years old again, helpless and terrified. Porter, still on the video call, watched in horror as the scene unfolded. He immediately alerted hospital security, knowing Thomas would try to leave surgery if he learned what was happening. The medical team couldn't risk stopping the delicate procedure, even as chaos erupted at the mansion. Magnus had planned his escape route carefully. Using the confusion caused by multiple security breaches, he dragged Sarah through the service corridors, heading for the same tunnel he had used to enter. Her attempts to resist, to cry out, were met with the same brutal efficiency he had always used to silence her. "You thought you could escape me," he hissed as they moved through the dark tunnel. "You belong to me, Sarah. You always will. And after we're done here, we'll pay your dear uncle a visit in the hospital. Make sure he never interferes again." The threat to Thomas gave Sarah a surge of desperate courage. She fought harder, screaming despite the hand clamped over her mouth. Above ground, the security team had finally realized the other breaches were diversions. Morrison organized a systematic sweep of the property, but the precious minutes lost to Magnus's deceptions had given him the head start he needed. When they discovered the service tunnel, they found only Sarah's dropped photograph, Magnus's final taunt. At the hospital, Thomas lay unconscious as surgeons worked to repair his damaged heart. The operating room staff had been instructed not to reveal anything about Sarah's kidnapping, knowing the stress could kill him during this critical procedure. But even in his sedated state, Thomas seemed to sense something was wrong. His heart rate became erratic, causing the surgical team to pause several times to stabilize him. Magnus led Sarah to a waiting van, its plate stolen, its interior modified for his purpose. But he had underestimated one thing: Sarah wasn't the same terrified child he had controlled for so long. In the weeks with Thomas, she had begun to heal, to find her strength. As Magnus opened the van's door, Sarah made her move. She twisted in his grip, using a self-defense technique Thomas's security team had taught her, and bit down hard on Magnus's hand. His grip loosened just enough for her to slip away. She ran, not toward the mansion where guards would be searching, but toward the garage where she knew Thomas's driver kept a second security vehicle. Magnus pursued her, his fury making him careless for the first time. "You ungrateful little brat," he roared, his carefully constructed facade of the concerned father finally cracking. "I'll teach you what happens to children who don't obey." But his words no longer held the power to paralyze her with fear. Sarah reached the garage, her lungs burning, and found what she was looking for: not just the security vehicle, but the panic button Thomas had installed in every building on the property. As Magnus burst through the door, she slammed her hand down on it, setting off alarms throughout the estate. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Magnus, realizing his careful plan was unraveling, made one last grab for Sarah. But she was ready, dropping and rolling under a workbench, buying precious seconds until help arrived. The garage filled with security teams, their weapons trained on Magnus, but Sarah kept her eyes closed, focusing on the breathing exercises Thomas had taught her for moments of panic. When she finally opened her eyes, Magnus was in handcuffs, his face contorted with a rage she had seen too many times before. But this time, instead of cowering, Sarah stood straight and looked him in the eye. "You don't own me anymore," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "You never did." The news of Sarah's attempted kidnapping reached the hospital through Porter's urgent calls. Among the medical staff attending to Thomas were several former Mitchell Enterprises employees who had lost their jobs during the Christmas incident. Dr. Rachel Chen, the chief cardiac surgeon, had been the hospital's representative at that ill-fated charity drive. Now, with Thomas's life literally in her hands, she faced a moment of profound moral choice. "We need to tell him," insisted Dr. Martin, an anesthesiologist. "It's his niece. He has a right to know," but Rachel shook her head, her hands steady as she continued the delicate procedure. "If we tell him now, the stress could kill him. Our job is to save his life so he can protect her." The operating room became a nexus of silent support. Nurses who had once cursed Thomas's name now worked with fierce determination to keep him alive. They understood better than most how trauma could twist a person, how fear could masquerade as cruelty. The same hands that had packed up their office belongings months ago now monitored his vital signs with unwavering attention. Word spread through the hospital. Emily, a nurse Thomas had fired for organizing Christmas caroling, coordinated with security to strengthen the hospital's protection. She remembered how Thomas had looked that day, not angry but terrified, and suddenly his actions made a horrible kind of sense. In the hospital pharmacy, David Chen, who had lost his corporate job over a small Christmas tree at his desk, worked quickly to prepare emergency medications. "I have a daughter Sarah's age," he told his colleagues as they double-checked everything. "What that monster did to her, to Thomas, we have to help." The hospital cafeteria staff, including 3 former Mitchell employees, prepared care packages for the security teams. They remembered their own children's joy at the charity drive Thomas had destroyed, but now they understood the pain behind his actions. Their anger had transformed into determination to help prevent another child from suffering. Dr. Chen's team worked with practiced precision, but the surgery proved more complicated than anticipated. Thomas's heart, weakened by years of carrying his trauma alone, required additional procedures. Each time his vitals wavered, the team fought harder, their professional detachment giving way to personal investment in his survival. Sarah's security detail arrived at the hospital, establishing a protective perimeter. They found unexpected allies in the staff, many of whom volunteered to work extra shifts to ensure every entrance was monitored. The same people who had once feared Thomas's cold authority now stood guard over him, understanding that his cruelty had been a shield for deeper wounds. In the surgical waiting room, Porter coordinated with both hospital security and the police. He noticed how the staff seemed to move with extra purpose, how even those Thomas had fired now worked to protect him. The Christmas decorations in the hospital corridors, which would have once triggered Thomas's rage, stood as silent witnesses to this transformation. Dr. Chen, hours into the surgery, received word that Magnus had been captured. She kept the news to herself, knowing Thomas needed to remain stable, but she allowed herself a small smile behind her surgical mask. The man who had once seemed like a heartless tyrant was, in fact, fighting to protect a child from the very trauma that had shaped him. The support staff who had lost their hospital contracts with Mitchell Enterprises now worked overtime to ensure everything ran smoothly. They coordinated with police, managed media inquiries, and maintained a protective circle around both Thomas and Sarah. Their actions spoke of something deeper than professional duty. It was a recognition of shared humanity, of understanding that sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones we cannot see. As the surgery entered its critical phase, Dr. Chen thought about the Christmas charity drive that had cost them their jobs. She remembered thinking Thomas was a monster for denying help to orphaned children. Now, her hands deep in his chest, trying to heal his physical heart while knowing the emotional damage it had endured, she understood. They were not just saving a patient, they were helping to break a cycle of abuse that had spanned generations. The hospital halls, usually quiet during surgery, hummed with purposeful activity. Every person, from janitors to specialists, felt part of something larger than themselves. They were not just protecting a wealthy businessman, they were standing guard over a wounded child who had grown up to rescue another from the same nightmare. When the surgery finally reached its conclusion, Dr. Chen stepped back, exhausted but satisfied. Thomas would live, his heart stronger now than it had been in years. As she left the operating room, she saw the former Mitchell employees gathered in the hallway, their faces showing the same mix of concern and determination she felt. "He'll make it," she told them simply. The relief in the room was palpable. These people, who had once felt the sting of Thomas's trauma-driven actions, now celebrated his survival. They understood that healing comes in many forms, and sometimes the path to redemption requires us to help those who have hurt us. The final confrontation between Thomas and Magnus took place 3 weeks after the surgery, in a secure room at the county courthouse. Thomas, still weak but determined, sat across from the man who had haunted his nightmares for decades. Magnus wore prison orange, his hands cuffed, but his eyes still carried that familiar cruel gleam. "You look terrible," son Magnus said, his voice dripping with mock concern. "That heart of yours always was too weak. Just like your mother's, the guards shifted uncomfortably, but Thomas remained still, studying the man who had terrorized his childhood. The years had weathered Magnus, but evil had preserved him in its own way. "We found them all," Thomas said quietly, placing a thick folder on the table. "Every child you adopted, every life you destroyed, every identity you stole." He opened the folder, spreading photographs across the table, dozens of children, spanning decades. "They're not afraid anymore, Magnus. They're coming forward, all of them." Magnus's smirk faltered for a moment. Accusations from troubled children, he scoffed, but there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice. Who would believe them over a caring father? "I gave them homes when no one else would. I made them strong." "You made them victims," Thomas corrected, his voice steady. "But they survived. They rebuilt their lives. And now they're going to make sure you never hurt another child." He pulled out one final photograph, Sarah's mother, Catherine. "Starting with what you did to my sister." The mention of Catherine caused something to shift in Magnus's expression. "She was weak, just like you," he snarled, leaning forward despite his restraints. "She thought she could escape, start a new life. I showed her how wrong she was. And Sarah, she's just like her mother, destined to learn the same lesson." Thomas felt his recently repaired heart racing, but he maintained his composure. "No, Magnus. Sarah is stronger than all of us. She broke your hold over her. She's helping other victims find their voice. Your legacy isn't fear anymore, it's the strength of those who survived you." Magnus lunged across the table, his cuffed hands reaching for Thomas's throat. The guards moved to restrain him, but Thomas didn't flinch. He stood calmly, watching as the man who had once seemed all-powerful was dragged back to his chair, raging and spitting threats. "You think this is over?" Magnus shouted, his careful facade finally cracking completely. "You think a few court cases can erase what I built? I owned you. I owned all of you. You're nothing without me." His voice echoed off the concrete walls, the sound of desperation rather than power. Thomas walked slowly around the table, stopping just out of Magnus's reach. "That's where you're wrong," he said softly. "We were always something. We were children who deserved love, not torture. We were human beings, not your possessions. And now we're the ones who will make sure you die in prison, alone and powerless, just like you made us feel." Magnus's face contorted with rage. "I'll get out," he threatened. "I always do. And when I do, I'll find her. I'll find all of them. They'll learn what happens to children who disobey." The words were familiar, but they had lost their power to terrify. "No, you won't," Thomas replied, pulling out one final document. "Because every survivor is testifying. Every identity you created is being unraveled. Every crime you committed is being exposed. Your empire of fear is over, Magnus, and we're all here to watch it burn." He turned to leave, but Magnus called after him, his voice carrying that old venom. "You're still that scared little boy, Thomas, running away just like always. You think you've won. You'll never be free of me. I'm in your blood, in your nightmares, in every Christmas you can't celebrate." Thomas paused at the door, looking back at the pathetic figure Magnus had become. "You're wrong again," he said. "This Christmas, I'm celebrating with Sarah and every other survivor. We're decorating a tree, exchanging gifts, and creating new memories. And you'll be in a cell, watching your power fade away, day by day, until you're nothing but a cautionary tale." Magnus screamed in rage, fighting against his restraints, but Thomas was already walking away. In his fury, Magnus had revealed his true self, not the monster of Thomas's childhood, but a weak, desperate man whose only power had come from terrorizing children. Outside the courthouse, Sarah waited with Porter and a group of survivors. They looked at Thomas expectantly, and he managed a small smile. "It's over," he said simply. "He can't hurt any of us anymore." The relief on their faces was palpable, years of fear finally beginning to lift. Sarah took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Can we really have Christmas this year?" she asked, hope mixing with lingering uncertainty in her voice. Thomas pulled her into a careful hug, his healing heart full of something that felt like peace. "Yes," he promised. "We can have all the Christmases we missed, and this time they'll be filled with joy, not fear." As they left the courthouse together, Thomas realized that the confrontation had freed something in him too. The scared little boy he'd been could finally rest, knowing that the monster under his bed had been exposed for what it truly was, nothing but a coward who preyed on children's fears. The complications during Thomas's surgery came without warning. One moment his vitals were stable, the next, alarms were screaming across the operating room. Dr. Chen's hands moved with practiced precision, but Thomas's heart wasn't responding to treatment. The muscle, weakened by years of carrying unspoken trauma, began to fail. "He's crashing," Dr. Chen announced, her voice sharp with urgency. Starting cardiac massage, her hands worked rhythmically, trying to force life back into the failing organ. The monitors showed his blood pressure plummeting, each beat becoming weaker than the last. In the depths of unconsciousness, Thomas found himself in a familiar place, his childhood home, on that fateful Christmas night. But this time, something was different. Instead of the terror and chaos of his memories, he saw his mother standing by the Christmas tree, just as she had before everything went wrong. Mummy's voice came out small, childlike. She turned to him, her smile as warm as he remembered. "My brave boy," she said softly. "You've carried so much pain for so long." She reached for him, and he felt the warmth of her touch, a sensation he had forgotten after decades of building walls around himself. In the operating room, Dr. Chen called for the defibrillator. Charging to 300, she commanded. Clear Thomas's body arched with the shock, but his heart remained stubbornly arrhythmic. The surgical team moved with increasing urgency, their actions betraying the gravity of the situation. In his vision, Thomas walked closer to his mother, noticing Catherine standing beside her. His sister looked just as she had before Magnus found her, young and full of life. "Katie," he whispered, guilt crushing his chest. "I'm so sorry. I should have protected you." Catherine shook her head, her eyes gentle. "You were a child too, Thomas. But look what you're doing now. You're protecting Sarah. You're breaking the cycle." She gestured to the Christmas tree, where dozens of ornaments hung, each one bearing the name of a child Magnus had hurt, each one shining with the promise of healing. Charging again, Dr. Chen's voice cut through the tension. Clear another shock, another moment of desperate hope. The monitors continued their ominous warning, the line of Thomas's heartbeat becoming increasingly erratic. In his vision, Thomas felt torn. The warmth and peace here were seductive, offering an escape from the pain he'd carried for so long. His mother seemed to sense his thoughts. "It's not your time," she said firmly. "Sarah needs you. All of them need you." "But I'm tired," Thomas admitted, voicing a truth he'd never allowed himself to acknowledge. "I've been fighting for so long." Catherine stepped forward, taking his hand. "Then let others help you fight," she said. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." In the operating room, Dr. Chen made one final attempt. "Last try," she announced. "Maximum charge." Clear the shock coursed through Thomas's body, and for a moment everything hung in perfect stillness. In his vision, Thomas looked at his mother and sister one last time, memorizing their faces, their smiles, the love in their eyes. "Go," his mother urged gently. "Live the life we couldn't. Show Sarah the love we wanted to give you." With a sudden gasp, Thomas's heart began beating again. The monitors stabilized, showing a strong, regular rhythm. Dr. Chen exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "He's back," she announced. "Let's finish this." Later, when Thomas would try to describe his experience, he would find the words inadequate. How could he explain the feeling of his mother's love, the forgiveness in Catherine's eyes, the understanding that his life had purpose beyond his pain? But in his heart he carried a new certainty. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living for all of them. The discovery of Sarah's attempt came on a quiet Sunday morning, 3 days after Magnus's arrest. Thomas was still recovering in the hospital when Porter found her in the mansion's bathroom, an empty bottle of sleeping pills beside her unconscious form. The note she left was heartbreaking in its simplicity. "I'm sorry. I can't be strong anymore." Emergency responders worked quickly, but the following hours were a nightmare of uncertainty. Thomas, against medical advice, insisted on being wheeled to the pediatric ICU where Sarah lay pale and still, medical equipment beeping steadily around her. The doctors explained that they had pumped her stomach in time, but the emotional damage was harder to gauge. When Sarah finally opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was Thomas, still in his hospital gown, holding her hand. "I thought I was protecting you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Magnus said he would kill you if I stayed. He said everyone who tries to help me ends up hurt." Thomas felt his heart break all over again, understanding too well the twisted logic of abuse that had led her to this point. "Sarah," he said gently, "living is not what hurts me. Losing you would destroy me." His voice cracked with emotion. "We survived together or not at all." The recovery process was gradual and painful. Sarah began intensive therapy with Dr. Miranda Foster, a specialist in childhood trauma. Initially, she would only speak about surface things, her favorite books, the view from her hospital window, the flowers that arrived daily from Mitchell Enterprises employees. But slowly, with patience and gentle encouragement, she started to share deeper truths. She talked about the years of abuse, the constant fear, the belief that she was somehow responsible for everything bad that happened. She spoke about her mother, Catherine, and the fragments of happy memories she still carried. Thomas attended every session he was physically able to, learning how to support Sarah's healing while continuing his own. They discovered that their trauma responses mirrored each other, the same hypervigilance, the same difficulty trusting, the same tendency to shoulder blame for things beyond their control. The breakthrough came during a joint session when Sarah finally expressed her deepest fear. "What if I become like him?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if the darkness he put inside me never goes away?" Thomas reached for her hand, sharing the wisdom he had learned too late. "The darkness isn't you, Sarah. It's what was done to you. And every day you choose kindness, choose love, you prove that he failed to break your spirit." As Sarah grew stronger, she began to help other young survivors, speaking at support groups and sharing her story. Her attempted suicide transformed from a moment of despair into a powerful testimony about the importance of reaching out, of not carrying pain alone. Together, Sarah and Thomas learned that healing wasn't about erasing the past, but about building a future where their scars became proof of their resilience rather than markers of their pain. They established new traditions, small daily rituals that reinforced their connection and commitment to life. Each morning they would meet for breakfast and share one thing they were grateful for. Each evening they would read together in the library, building new memories in a space that had once witnessed Sarah's darkest moment. And slowly, day by day, the light in Sarah's eyes grew stronger, the shadows of the past receding in the face of hope and love. The truth about Maria Mitchell's death emerged during Magnus's pre-trial interrogation. Detective Sarah Reeves sat across from him in the interrogation room, reviewing old case files, when Magnus began to laugh, a chilling sound that made even the veteran investigator pause. "Did Thomas ever tell you about his mother's last Christmas?" Magnus asked, his eyes glinting with malicious pleasure. "About how she tried to make everything perfect that year? The decorations, the presents, the little traditions she thought would protect him." He leaned forward, savoring each word like poison. "She actually believed she could shield him from me." The detective maintained her composure, recording every word as Magnus continued his cruel narrative. "She'd been saving money, you see, planning to take Thomas and run. I found the bus tickets hidden in her Christmas cookie tin." His smile widened. "Such a fitting place to hide her hope, don't you think?" Magnus described in horrifying detail how he had forced Maria to watch as he destroyed each carefully wrapped present, how he had made her string up the Christmas lights, even as he threatened her life. "I wanted her to understand," he said. "That hope was a luxury she couldn't afford." The final moments of Maria Mitchell's life were more terrible than anyone had imagined. According to Magnus, he had forced her to write a suicide note, making Thomas believe his mother had abandoned him. The boy needed to learn. Magnus insisted that love makes you weak. That trust gets you killed. When Detective Reeves brought this information to Thomas, she found him in the hospital garden with Sarah. She watched as he absorbed each devastating detail, his face growing paler but his spine remaining straight. Sarah gripped his hand tighter with each revelation, their shared pain creating a bond stronger than Magnus's cruelty. "There's more," the detective said gently. "We found your mother's real note. Magnus didn't destroy it completely. She handed Thomas a fragile, partially burned piece of paper. The words were faded but clear. My dearest Thomas, never let him make you believe love is weakness. Your heart is your strength. I will always..." The rest was lost to fire and time, but those words, his mother's true last message, shattered something in Thomas. He wept then, for the first time in decades, with Sarah holding him just as he had held her through her darkest moments. They cried together for Maria Mitchell, for Catherine, for all the love that Magnus had tried to destroy. But even in this moment of deepest pain, there was a kind of liberation. Magnus's revelation meant to wound, instead freed Thomas from years of believing his mother had chosen to leave him. The truth, though horrific, confirmed what his heart had always known, that his mother's love had been real, unconditional, and strong enough to defy Magnus even in death. Sarah, looking at the note, spoke softly. She was right, you know. Love isn't weakness. It's what saved us both. Thomas looked at his niece, seeing in her face the same strength that had lived in his mother, in Catherine, in all those who had chosen love over fear. Magnus had intended his confession to be a final act of cruelty, but instead it became a catalyst for healing. Thomas and Sarah hung Maria's words in their home, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, love remains an unquenchable light. Magnus, in his attempt to destroy their faith in love, had inadvertently strengthened it, proving once again that some things are beyond the reach of even the cruelest hearts. Dr. Rachel Chen waited until Thomas was stable after his second surgery before sharing her story. Standing beside his hospital bed, her surgical mask now removed, she held a photograph that had yellowed with age. In it, a young Asian girl stood in front of Santa Esperanza Community Shelter, clutching a wrapped present. 20 years ago, she began, her voice soft but clear. A boy at the shelter gave me his only Christmas gift. He said someone else needed it more. She placed the photograph on Thomas's bedside table. That boy was you, Mr. Mitchell. And that gift changed my life. Thomas studied the photograph, memories slowly surfacing through the haze of post-operative medication. He remembered that Christmas, one of his first at the shelter after escaping Magnus. A new girl had arrived, recently orphaned, speaking barely any English. While other children celebrated with their presence, she had sat alone, silent, tears rolling down her face. But you gave me your chemistry set, Dr. Chen continued. You didn't know it then, but that gift sparked my interest in science. It was the first time since losing my parents that I felt like I had a future. She smiled, gesturing to her surgical scrubs. Now I'm the youngest chief of cardiac surgery in the hospital's history. Thomas remembered more now, how he had watched the girl's face light up as she opened the present, how her smile had warmed something in his frozen heart. It had been the first time he had felt something other than fear since leaving his father. I never knew, he whispered. That's why I fought so hard to save you today, Dr. Chen said, checking his vital signs with practiced ease. When I recognized you as the boy from the shelter, I knew I had to repay that kindness. You showed me that even in our darkest moments we can still choose to help others. She explained how she had followed his career over the years, watching as he built his company and fortune. I saw the news about Sarah, she added gently. About Magnus. I recognized the pattern, how trauma can make us build walls, push people away. But I also remembered that boy who gave away his only gift. That kindness was still inside you, just waiting to break free. Thomas looked at the monitors surrounding him, at the equipment that had helped save his life. You could have let me die, he said quietly. After how I treated everyone at the Christmas charity drive, it would have been justified." Dr. Chen shook her head firmly. "That's not how kindness works, Mr. Mitchell. 20 years ago, you didn't give me that gift because I deserved it. You gave it because you saw someone in pain and chose to help. Today, I did the same." She pulled out another photograph, more recent, showing her with a group of children at a free medical clinic. "Every Christmas, I volunteer here. I bring science kits, just like the one you gave me. Sometimes all it takes is one act of kindness to change a life's trajectory." Thomas felt tears threatening the second time since his surgery that his emotional walls had cracked. "I forgot," he admitted. "I forgot what it felt like to help someone without fear, without expecting pain in return." Dr. Chen checked his surgical site, her touch gentle but professional. "You remembered when it mattered most with Sarah. You broke free from Magnus's influence, just like I broke free from my grief. We're more than our traumas, Mr. Mitchell. We're the choices we make, the kindness we choose to show." Before leaving, she placed a small, wrapped package on his bedside table. "Merry Christmas," she said with a smile. "It's a chemistry set for Sarah. Because sometimes the best way to heal is to pass on the kindness we've received." Thomas watched her leave, the gift beside him a tangible reminder that even in our darkest moments, the light of compassion can guide us home. His newly repaired heart felt fuller, stronger, not just from the surgery but from the recognition that his capacity for kindness had survived, despite everything Magnus had done to destroy it. The tide of public opinion began to shift the day Magnus's victims started telling their stories on national television. The same media outlets that had condemned Thomas now broadcast images of dozens of survivors, each sharing eerily similar accounts of abuse, manipulation, and terror. The community that had once labeled Thomas a kidnapper watched in horror as the true monster was revealed. Emma Richardson, the former Mitchell Enterprises employee who had organized the Christmas charity drive, led the charge in changing the narrative. She organized a public forum where Magnus's victims could share their experiences, creating a platform for truth that could not be ignored. Local businesses that had once shunned Thomas now offered their support, their windows displaying posters that read, "We stand with Sarah." The school principal who had defended Magnus made a tearful public apology. "We failed Sarah," she admitted during a board meeting. "We saw the signs but chose to believe a convenient lie rather than face an uncomfortable truth." The teachers who had ignored Sarah's bruises and fearful behavior now underwent mandatory training in recognizing and reporting abuse. The neighborhood that had witnessed Sarah begging on cold streets came forward with security footage, photographs, and accounts of Magnus's cruelty. Street vendors who had previously supported Magnus's story now revealed how he had threatened them into silence, how they had watched helplessly as Sarah endured his abuse. Local police officers who had initially rushed to arrest Thomas now worked tirelessly to build a case against Magnus. They reviewed years of overlooked reports, interviewed witnesses who had been too afraid to speak, and uncovered a pattern of systematic abuse that spanned decades. The protesters who had gathered outside Mitchell Enterprises transformed their message. Instead of condemning Thomas, they now advocated for child abuse awareness and prevention. Their signs changed from accusations to messages of support, believe survivors, and break the cycle of abuse. Religious leaders who had once questioned Thomas's morality now preached about the importance of looking beneath the surface, of not judging based on appearances alone. They organized prayer vigils for Sarah and other survivors, creating safe spaces for healing and community support. The transformation was perhaps most visible during a community gathering organized in the hospital parking lot. Hundreds of people arrived, holding candles and standing in silent support as Thomas recovered from his surgery. Many held signs apologizing for their rush to judgment, for believing Magnus's lies, for failing to see the truth. Sarah watched from her hospital window as the crowd grew, their candles creating a sea of light in the darkness. "They understand now," she whispered to Thomas, who sat beside her in his wheelchair. "They finally see him for what he really is." The community's change of heart wasn't just about correcting a mistake, it was about learning a profound lesson in compassion and judgment. People began to understand that sometimes the most wounded among us hide behind walls of apparent coldness, that trauma can make us seem harsh when we're actually fighting to survive. Local businesses that had cancelled contracts with Mitchell Enterprises now reached out to renew partnerships, many offering additional support for the company's new initiatives supporting abuse survivors. The same newspapers that had painted Thomas as a villain now published in-depth investigations into child abuse and the system's failures to protect the vulnerable. The community's awakening to the truth became a catalyst for change, transforming not just their view of Thomas and Sarah, but their understanding of trauma, healing, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances. In acknowledging their mistake, they created something powerful, a united front against abuse, and a commitment to protecting society's most vulnerable members. The full extent of Magnus's crimes came to light during the trial preparation, when investigators uncovered a hidden safe in his office at the Children's Services Department. Inside, they found Catherine Mitchell's diary, meticulously documenting the years of abuse she had endured and her desperate attempts to protect her daughter from the same fate. The diary revealed a horrifying pattern. Catherine had discovered Magnus's true identity while working at a domestic violence shelter. She had been compiling evidence of his crimes, building a case to expose him. But Magnus had found out. The entries became increasingly frantic, describing how he had systematically isolated her, threatened Sarah's life, and finally cornered her in their apartment on a cold December night. "If anything happens to me," Catherine had written in her final entry, "know that it wasn't suicide. Magnus found the evidence. He knows I know everything. Sarah, my beautiful girl, I'm trying to get us out. Thomas, if you ever read this, I'm sorry I couldn't reach you in time. I found out he's our father. And he's done this to so many others." The evidence Catherine had gathered was comprehensive. Financial records showing money stolen from children's trust funds, photographs of abuse victims spanning decades, documentation of Magnus's various identities, and the network of corrupt officials who had helped him evade detection. She had been close to exposing everything when he silenced her. More shocking was the discovery of Magnus's own journals, where he detailed his methodology with clinical precision. He had specifically targeted children from broken homes, using his positions in social services to identify the most vulnerable. Sarah hadn't been a random victim. Magnus had orchestrated her placement in the system after Catherine's death, ensuring he could claim her. The investigation revealed that Magnus had maintained multiple identities simultaneously, running a complex operation that involved trafficking children through the foster care system. He had used his knowledge of the system's weaknesses to move children across state lines, making it nearly impossible to track his activities. Catherine's final act of defiance had been hiding copies of her evidence in various locations. One set had been mailed to a journalist, timed to arrive after her death, but Magnus's connections had intercepted it. Another had been encrypted and stored on servers that investigators only now managed to access. Her voice, silenced for so long, finally echoed through the courtroom as prosecutors presented her findings. Sarah, listening to her mother's words being read aloud, gripped Thomas's hand tightly. She never stopped fighting, she whispered, even when she knew what he would do to her. The diary entries painted a picture of a mother's desperate love, trying to protect not just her daughter but all the children Magnus had targeted. The most damning evidence came from Catherine's detailed account of Magnus's methodology. She had traced his activities back decades, finding patterns that law enforcement had missed. Each placement, each adoption, each tragic accident had been carefully planned to maintain his facade of respectability while feeding his need for control and cruelty. As the truth emerged, the scope of Magnus's crimes shocked, even hardened investigators. The number of lives he had destroyed, the systematic way he had exploited the system meant to protect children, the calculated cruelty of targeting his own family, it painted a picture of evil that was almost beyond comprehension. But Catherine's final message, found tucked into the last page of her diary, spoke not of defeat but of hope to those who survive him. Your strength is greater than his cruelty. The truth will come out. Love will win. In death, she had accomplished what she couldn't in life, exposing Magnus's crimes and ensuring he would never hurt another child. Mitchell Enterprises underwent a remarkable transformation during Thomas's recovery period. The cold, sterile offices that had once reflected his emotional walls were redesigned into warm, welcoming spaces. The company's mission shifted from merely creating sustainable products to actively supporting survivors of abuse and their families. The change began with the physical space itself. The stark white walls now featured artwork created by children in recovery programs. The once forbidden Christmas decorations became year-round reminders of healing and hope. Conference rooms were renamed after survivors who had shown exceptional courage in speaking out against abuse. Emma Richardson, reinstated as Director of Community Outreach, implemented a revolutionary workplace policy. The company began actively recruiting survivors of abuse, providing them with not just employment but comprehensive support systems. On-site counseling services, flexible work hours, and emergency housing assistance became standard benefits. The Sustainable Design Division, once focused on luxury products, now created specialized furniture and environments for children's shelters and therapy centers. Engineers worked with child psychologists to develop spaces that promoted healing and safety. Every product was tested and approved by survivors, ensuring that their needs and experiences were centered in the design process. Thomas, though still physically recovering, attended weekly staff meetings via video conference. His employees noticed a profound change in his leadership style. The man who had once ruled through fear and intimidation now listened intently, offered gentle guidance, and celebrated his team's initiatives to help others. The company's profits, rather than declining as some board members had feared, actually increased. Clients were drawn to the authentic mission of social responsibility, and employee productivity soared in the more supportive environment. Mitchell Enterprises became a model for corporate transformation, proving that compassion and success could go hand in hand. Thomas established a foundation in Catherine's name, dedicated to reforming the child welfare system and supporting abuse survivors. The same determination that had once driven him to build walls now fueled his mission to tear them down, creating pathways for healing and hope. Sarah became a regular presence in the office, her resilience and courage inspiring everyone around her. She worked with the design team, offering insights from a survivor's perspective that proved invaluable in creating truly supportive environments. Employees who had once feared Thomas now watched in amazement as he gently guided his niece through the process of healing while continuing his own recovery. The company's annual reports now included metrics beyond financial success. Numbers of survivors helped, families supported, lives transformed. The cold efficiency that had once defined Mitchell Enterprises gave way to a warmer, more human approach to business. Yet this change didn't weaken the company. Instead, it gave it a stronger foundation built on genuine purpose and shared values. The Catherine Mitchell Foundation emerged from a promise whispered in a hospital room. Thomas and Sarah, both still recovering from their respective traumas, decided that Catherine's legacy would be one of protection and hope, not tragedy. The foundation launched with a bold mission to revolutionize how society handles child abuse cases and supports survivors. Located in a renovated Victorian mansion, the foundation's headquarters was designed to feel like a home rather than an institution. The entrance featured a wall of butterflies, each representing a child who had found safety through their programs. The symbolism was clear: transformation and hope were possible, even after the darkest experiences. The Foundation's first initiative was the Safe Haven program, establishing a network of emergency shelters specifically designed for children escaping abuse. Each shelter incorporated elements suggested by survivors: secret gardens for quiet reflection, art rooms for emotional expression, and specially trained therapy dogs to provide comfort and unconditional love. Sarah took an active role in developing the Foundation's youth programs. Drawing from her own experience, she created support groups where young survivors could share their stories without judgment. These groups became safe spaces where children learned they weren't alone, that their experiences didn't define their futures. The Foundation also tackled systemic issues, working to reform child protective services and strengthen abuse prevention programs. They funded research into trauma-informed care, developed training programs for teachers and healthcare workers, and advocated for stronger child protection laws. Thomas ensured that every aspect of the Foundation operated with transparency and accountability. Regular audits and impact assessments demonstrated the effectiveness of their programs. The results spoke volumes: thousands of children protected, families supported, and lives transformed. Innovation became a cornerstone of the Foundation's approach. They developed a mobile app that provided immediate access to resources and support for children at risk. Virtual reality therapy programs help survivors process trauma in safe, controlled environments. Every technological advance was evaluated through the lens of genuine care and support. The Foundation's annual Butterfly Ball became a powerful symbol of transformation. Survivors shared their stories of healing, donors pledged support, and the community came together to celebrate resilience and hope. The event, once focused solely on fundraising, evolved into a celebration of survival and renewal. Catherine's spirit infused every aspect of the Foundation's work. Her diary entries, carefully selected and shared with permission, helped others understand the complex dynamics of abuse and the importance of early intervention. Her final message, that love would triumph over cruelty, became the Foundation's guiding principle. Through the Foundation, Thomas and Sarah found a way to transform their pain into purpose. Each child helped, each family supported, each life touched became part of Catherine's legacy, a testament to the power of love to overcome even the darkest circumstances. The first Christmas celebration at the Mitchell Mansion marked a profound transformation. The once forbidden holiday became a symbol of healing and new beginnings. The grand entrance hall, where Thomas had once fired employees for Christmas decorations, now sparkled with thousands of lights, each representing a survivor who had found their way to freedom. Sarah took charge of decorating the main Christmas tree, a massive pine that reached toward the mansion's vaulted ceiling. She carefully placed ornaments created by children from the Foundation's programs, painted butterflies, paper stars, and small ceramic hearts, each telling a story of resilience and hope. Thomas watched her work, marveling at how far they'd both come from their days of fear and isolation. The guest list reflected their expanded definition of family. Dr. Chen arrived with science kits for the children. Emma Richardson brought her famous hot chocolate. Former employees, now partners in their mission of healing, filled the mansion with laughter and warmth. Survivors from the Foundation's programs joined the celebration, each carrying their own stories of transformation. In the kitchen, the staff prepared a feast that honored diverse traditions. Everyone contributed something: cookies from old family recipes, dishes that represented their cultural heritage, comfort foods that carried memories of better times. The dining room table, once a symbol of Thomas's solitary existence, now stretched to accommodate their growing family. The evening's highlight came when Thomas gathered everyone in the great room. He stood before the fireplace, Sarah at his side, and shared the story of his mother's last Christmas message, that love was not weakness, but strength. He spoke of Catherine's courage, of Sarah's resilience, of the countless survivors who had shown him that family isn't just about blood, but about choice and healing. Children from the Foundation's programs performed a holiday concert, their voices filling the mansion with songs of joy and hope. Thomas, who had once banned even the hint of Christmas music, found himself singing along, his deep voice joining the chorus. Sarah caught his eye and smiled, remembering how far they'd come from those dark days of fear and silence. The gift exchange wasn't about expensive presents, but meaningful connections. Each gift carried a story, a message of understanding and support. Thomas received a handmade scarf from a young survivor who had learned to knit as therapy. Sarah was given a collection of letters from other children who saw her as their beacon of hope. As the evening drew to a close, they gathered around the tree for a new tradition. Each person hung a small mirror ornament, symbolizing their commitment to reflect light into the dark corners where abuse thrived. The tree became a glittering testament to their collective strength and determination to make a difference. Thomas stood back, watching as Sarah helped a young girl hang her ornament. His newly healed heart felt full in a way he had never thought possible. This was what his mother had tried to teach him, what Catherine had died protecting. What Sarah had helped him rediscover. The true meaning of Christmas wasn't in the decorations or presents, but in the courage to love and be loved. As the last guest departed, Thomas and Sarah remained by the tree, its lights twinkling in the quiet mansion. "Merry Christmas," Uncle Thomas Sarah whispered, hugging him tightly. Thomas held her close, feeling the weight of all their past Christmases lifting away, replaced by the promise of many more filled with love, family, and hope. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. We'd love to hear your thoughts on Thomas and Sarah's story. What moments touched you most? Please share your reflections in the comments below. Your support means everything to our team. Consider subscribing to join our storytelling community and help us continue creating meaningful narratives that inspire hope and healing. If this story moved you, share it with friends and family who might find comfort in its message. Don't forget to hit the like button to help others discover this story of transformation and redemption.